The UCP have proposed a deployment plan for the potential Alberta police force. What is most interesting is that the province is still not fully committed to the idea. To talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us from Edmonton. Tyler, is the idea of gaining even more traction? An initiative like this would be quite costly and would see a major reorganization of RCMP detachments across the province.
Yeah, so what was released this week was essentially the boots on the ground kind of plan, and sort of the high level overview of it is that the government is proposing to sort of reorganize the 113 RCMP detachments into about 65 to 80 community detachments, then 20 to 30 sort of service hubs, they're calling them. So that's where you would have things like the tactical and canine units that'd be in sort of larger but still small centers. And the idea is to sort of take some of these services and move them from Edmonton and Calgary into smaller sort of population areas. And what the government says this will do is set a minimum detachment size of 10 officers. Apparently some detachments in the province are more like 3 officers, and that should help things like response time and all that sort of stuff. It would amount to, the government says, about 275 new officers in sort of rural and small town Alberta. So this is sort of the logistics of it, not a super exciting announcement, but it gives us a look at what this could look like. And as you mentioned, the really strange thing is they haven't fully committed to it. They're still in sort of the study phase, the consultation phase. There'll be even more consultations with Indigenous communities if this goes ahead. I asked Tyler Shandro on Tuesday, the Justice Minister, I said, look, can you put a number between 1 and 10 on where you guys are at on this? And he said, well, it's really going to be up to the next government to make a decision on this. So, could be another UCP government, could be the New Democrats, who have been, really critical of this. They called it a boondoggle on Tuesday. So probably not going to happen if the NDP forms government next spring.
And a lot of the detractors, those who are against the idea of an Alberta Provincial Police Force, have been talking about how much more money it will cost Alberta taxpayers. What are you hearing right now?
Well, that's right. In particular, the rural municipalities sort of came together at a general meeting earlier this year and sort of officially said, no, we don't approve of this. We don't have enough answers. We're worried about a downloading of costs. And the issue basically is that with the RCMP, you have a cost sharing agreement between the province, municipalities, and the federal government. And I believe the federal government's chunk of that is about $170 million. So the province would lose that money if it transitioned to its own police force, and would have to make it up somewhere else. And then, of course, there's all the rest of it, right? There's detachments. Do you need to build them? Are you going to rent them or lease them? There's the equipment. Are you going to buy that from the RCMP? Do you have to source it? So there's a whole sort of separate pot of money, I think about $400 million that would have to go to simple transition costs. So, there's the deployment issue, there's the politics of it, and, also the financial implications.
Tyler, we've been chatting a lot about the UCP leadership quite a bit here, but it appears as though the Alberta Liberal Party cannot find a new leader. The nomination period passed without anyone officially putting their name forward.
Yeah, so once a party that formed government, about 100 years ago, I think, but they did form government at one point, and they couldn't find anyone. So the party is still going to have its interim leader for the time being. They did say they had interest in it, but for sort of personal reasons, people didn't want to step up and become the party leader. So a bit unclear, let's say, about what that party's future is going to look like. And I think the probable explanation for this is that the progressives in the province have just sort of lined up behind the New Democrats, sort of a two-party system as opposed to a multi-party system. Yeah. We've seen sort of the same thing on the right with the Freedom Conservative Party, with the Wild Rose Independence Party, just haven't really managed to make a big splash here. So just, shifting dynamics, I think, across the province in terms of where people are casting ballots.
Now, when it comes to the UCP leadership, Danielle Smith received more endorsements recently. That included our own Lethbridge East MLA Nathan Newdorf, former Justice Minister Casey Medew, and former Ag Minister Devin Dreeshen.
And also, a couple people have switched their allegiances from Travis Taves to Danielle Smith, notably Nate Glubish, I believe the Service Alberta Minister, and Pat Wren, who's Northern Alberta MLA. So, there's folks sort of lining up behind Danielle Smith. She's getting a lot of the press. She's getting a lot of attention. Everyone is sort of responding to the announcements she's made. The Alberta Sovereignty Act, for example, that's the thing that people are responding to, as opposed to sort of really being able to seize the narrative, I guess, on their own. But the thing to keep in mind, of course, is that there is the attention someone's getting, and there's the memberships that people have managed to sign up, and the ground game, and the phoning supporters, and all that stuff. So, from the outside looking in, it's a little bit hard to say, what the dynamic is. But there's no doubt about it that Danielle Smith looks like the front runner at this point.
Also on the leadership trail, Brian Jean has vowed to tax companies that use commuter workforces, hoping them to maybe hire more locals, or for commuting workers to actually become Alberta residents.
Right. And of course, Alberta has a large commuter workforce. You think of all the people from the Maritimes in particular who came to work in the oil sands. So Brian Jean, of course, from oil country up north there. And, he's said that this will have implications for the oil sands industry, and also talking a little bit about, what about healthcare? If you can get people to come to Alberta to work in the healthcare industry, maybe settle in smaller towns or places that are hurting for staff, he thinks that this might be, a way to encourage people to come here and stay here. And Alberta has like a huge quarterly migrations, between about 7,000 and 17,000, I think, people per quarter, sort of over the last 5 or 6 years. Obviously, the pandemic made that drop to more like 1,000 or 2,000. But lots of migration in and out of or into the province, I should say. So this is a potential strategy to get people to permanently stick around. And as I just said, people playing response to Danielle Smith. Well, here's an example of someone trying to break out and get a little bit of attention with a policy announcement.
Let's talk about more people moving to our beautiful province, migrating here. The UCP launched their new advertising campaign called Albertas Calling. It's directed at workers in Vancouver and Toronto. Now, you and I have been to both of those cities here. Alberta is much more affordable here. It's fairly safe. There seems to be a lot of solid opportunities here. Do you think many people and workers from Vancouver and Toronto would consider moving to Alberta?
Well, it's a good question because, one of the things that there's been a little bit of research on it, a couple studies in the last year or two, and one of the things that people have been leery of is sort of the culture, the political culture. Of course, Vancouver, very different political culture. Toronto, very different political culture than parts of Alberta, certainly. You're going to have a very different experience politically in Medicine Hat or Lethbridge compared to, downtown Edmonton. So that's something that actually the campaign does not talk about very much. It really talks about the economics of it, the affordable housing, the job opportunities, the fact that salaries are considerably higher here. And it's, sort of a bus campaign and a transit station campaign with posters and things like that. And it's, I believe, a $2.5 million advertising campaign. So, one of those things that I think is very, very hard to predict whether or not it'll work. But, given the way the economy is looking right now, which is pretty good, and given that some businesses are struggling to attract a workforce, we have a burgeoning tech sector, the film industry, and so on and so forth. There might be an opportunity there. Certainly, the government thinks there is.
Also, don't forget too, we only have a GST here, not an HST. So
that's right. The lower tax burden will certainly be a selling point for some people, I'm sure.
Now, Tyler, a couple of folks have announced that they will not be running in the next provincial election in 2023. Most notably is Darren Billis, following a 10-year career as an NDP politician.
It's tempting to read a lot into these sort of announcements, I think. You look at Darren Billis, you say, oh, well, why is he leaving after, a successful career? What's going on in the NDP? There isn't really any evidence of that sort of thing. And the other person who's leaving politics is Doug Schweitzer, who is the Justice Minister, I think, back when the UCP first formed government. And it's sort of, and again, it's sort of a similar thing. You could do this kind of analysis. Is Schweitzer more on sort of the moderate wing of the United Conservatives? If he's looking at a potential Danielle Smith victory, maybe he wants to get out. Not saying there's evidence for any of this, but this is one of the things that you can sort of keep an eye on in the weeks and months to come. Who's staying, who's going, who's replacing these people, and maybe what does that say about the party, and what does that say about moving forward? Let's say the New Democrats form government in 10 months' time or 8 months' time, whatever it is. Darren Billis would have been a cabinet minister again, most likely. So who's going to fill his boots moving forward? So just a small little story, but in some ways you can think about what it tells us about the state of Alberta politics, I think.
Read between the lines, absolutely.
Exactly.
Tyler, Premier Jason Kenney has made a comment on the Alberta Sovereignty Act. Speaking on his radio show over the weekend, Kenney called Danielle Smith's proposal nuts.
He sure did, and said it would make Alberta the laughingstock of the country, said it would be a body blow to industry. So very briefly, for viewers that might not be up to speed on it, the Alberta Sovereignty Act is a proposal from the Danielle Smith campaign that would basically, if it worked, say that Alberta could ignore federal law, could ignore federal court rulings, could ignore federal regulatory decisions, say around industrial projects, things like that. It's been honestly fairly widely criticized by scholars and by politicians. But I think this is the first time that Premier Kenney has spoken out about it. A couple other people in the party have as well, most notably Jason Nixon, who said he doesn't even think it would pass the legislature, even if the UCP was in government. So, this is another example of what we talked about earlier, of people responding to what Danielle Smith is putting out there. And so Kenney criticized it. Danielle Smith said, this is premature. Wait till you see the legislation, that kind of thing. So if she ends up becoming the leader, becoming the premier, we should find out relatively early on in her tenure what this might look like.
Tyler, it appears as though the Alberta government found itself embroiled in some controversy over an essay about women and their role in society. A written piece that finished in third place in this essay writing contest.
Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one. It was 5 essays submitted to this contest about women. And this essay in particular was basically about how women have this sort of unique role as childbearing and child-rearing members of society, and that they should perhaps not be working in order to focus on that. There should be medals and awards given to women who have children. And also it sort of argued that there was sort of this cultural suicide happening by women not having children. So this sparked a huge controversy, a middle of summer controversy, but a controversy nonetheless, with people criticizing it as racist and sexist. And it was just sort of this weird thing because nobody in the government really seemed to know what happened or how this happened or who awarded the prize. You had some apologies from ministers who were involved. The NDPs called for resignations. Kenney said it was a mistake. There haven't been resignations, and sort of very few answers at this point about what exactly happened. So just sort of, a number of unforced errors, I think, on the government's part. Maybe all their comm staff are on holidays right now or something. Who knows? Because it was a very strange one that maybe could have been dealt with in a matter of days instead of sort of consuming a news cycle for, about a week. But a weird one nonetheless.
Now, Tyler, turning to healthcare, the NDP have been hammering away on the issue here in the province. The Rachel Notley crew have been talking a lot about ambulance delays, lack of ambulances for emergencies, and overcrowded emergency rooms.
Right. So these are, not particularly new issues in terms of Alberta or the healthcare system, and, not unique to Alberta at all. British Columbia is having the same problem in some of its small towns. But, the thing to note about this is not that it's, special or new or anything like that, but the NDP very firmly believe that this is a really, really important issue to Albertans, and that this really resonates with Albertans, and that this is a thing that they can talk about on the lead up to the next election. They can talk about it during the election, and that's going to resonate. So it's an early look, an ongoing look at one of the things that the NDP really thinks is important and really thinks is something that will bring them voters and keep their voters, something that they think they have a better record on, a better potential on than the United Conservatives. So it's again, looking at that election 8 or 10 months down the road, what are the NDP talking about? And certainly the big one, as it has always been, is healthcare. So it'll be interesting to see how their attacks, how their lines sort of shift on that in the months ahead.
What it should also be a big election issue as well is how a lot of the municipalities, including here in Lethbridge, are not happy with the province centralizing EMS Dispatch. The province says, well, we're saving about $600 million a year doing this. What are you hearing now? Is there potential with maybe the new UCP leaders saying, you know what, we're going to go back to decentralization and having the municipalities have more of a hand in ambulance services?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm racking my brains a little bit on what they've actually said about it. And I do think it's one of those things that we could see some movement on with a new leader. And I think there is a study being done on it at the moment. I can't remember by whom, but it is sort of being looked at. So, certainly there's a lot of pressure, and it's a little bit like the coal thing that happened, that had been earlier this year, where the UCP suddenly changed this thing and outraged all these sort of small conservative parts of Alberta and had to sort of back down. So you could see some movement on it, I think, and certainly if the New Democrats win the next election, I think that there will be some major changes to that.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks again for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.